like the awards. Yeah.
Sophie is sick today, so I did that a little more slowly so we can have everything there. And we've got 3 options of what we can do. First of all is to go over ideas for papers that anyone wants to discuss. So we'll hesitate for that first. Anyone have an idea, rough at all? Anything that you're struggling with, you want to talk about? We're happy to try, listen, comment. Okay. Number 2 is to go over any readings in the sections that we have gone over rapidly. So the whole second half, as you notice, there are lots of items listed, but most with no stars. And so they're mostly there for reference. And as it says in one section, look at an individual city that you're interested in or something of that sort. So it's not, these are not key readings. There are 1 or 2 that are checked with stars, and those are the 2 or 3 key readings which I've already discussed for the most part, like Barbara Furman's book, and then the Furman Grimshaw. And then we had the section on the policy outputs and the arts, which we don't, with the arts section is new, and we went over that sort of rapidly. So that's one thing that we might well cover a little bit more. But let me get some chewing gum so I don't lose my voice. As best we can. And so I'm sort of asking as well, actually let me mention a 4th point. Congratulations on your postings. I looked through and commented in turn on several of the postings and was delighted to see your engagement. One point that several of you made was, I live in Cincinnati or somewhere where most people drive. Yeah, that's the U.S. Something like 90% of Americans drive to work. And so most of the U.S. is not set up for divvy bicycles and buses. You know, even it's occasional buses, but not all that well. However, when I said the U.S. is not set up, we've got cities that were built pre and post automobile. If you look at American cities or European cities, Asian cities before 1890 to 1910, something like that, these were not automobile cities. Boston, New York, Chicago, downtown have walking as their base plan for architecture, housing. Things are close in. Second, there are new suburbs like Arlington Heights, Illinois, that has refashioned, it's re-engineered the whole town. It's far enough from downtown Chicago, must be 45 minutes to an hour it's past O'Hare. It's reconfigured itself like a downtown walkable city. Even though it has, I don't know, maybe 50,000 residents, you can walk to restaurants, shopping, laundry, cleaners, I mean, all the basics that you need. And many people, elderly, young people who don't want to have a car, people who want to go a little more distance and who may be in that, quasi-suburban, exurban area, choose Arlington Heights, just as there's some other sort of quasi-suburban cities or exurban cities that are small enough. Say, take the small towns in Texas or downstate Illinois. Those are made for walking, and people still do walk to high school, to shop, and so forth. So there are locations where you have this. That is, you don't need high density if you've only got a town of 250. So then everybody's near what there is, but there's one laundromat, one grocery store, and a high school and a high school if they're lucky, and a grammar school. So Richard Florida, for instance, has done a book called it's called The Big Restart, or The Big Reset, something like that. And basically, it was written soon after the last oil crisis, basically arguing and the collapse of the financial markets, driven, of course. I mean, what was the source of the last? Sometimes it's been called the Great Recession, but the max had something like a 10%, 12% unemployment rate. So it was really not that great compared to 1933, when roughly half the workforce was unemployed. But what was the driver, or the ostensible, simple, short-term, visible change that brought on the financial crisis of 2008?
The mortgage crisis?
Yes, the mortgage. So what's a mortgage?
A loan taken out on home.
Okay, it's a loan taken out normally on a single-family dwelling, although it could be a condo. But these are mostly, this is the driver of the great American suburban housing decentralization. 1. 2, the tax code is set up so it subsidizes mortgage payments and lets you write off the value of the home and not pay taxes. So this may change, but the point is, built into the American financial, legal, lifestyle system is the idea that we all need a suburban style home, and that we're not, and there's a student doing an MA or PhD, I guess, on this, yeah, PhD, on low-income African Americans in Chicago. And she just open-ended asked them, you know, why did you do this when you didn't have enough money and you've now lost the home and you've lost all your assets? It was the American dream. Again and again and again say, this is the American dream to have your own home. That is, this is part of culture, legal, financial, and cultural. This is it's a desire of many Americans. So Florida's at least raising the point, how could we change this? How can we get people away from this conception, and aren't there other conceptions? And the answer is, of course, that we have a massive number of people moving back to downtown areas, especially the people who have had children who have grown up and gone to college and then graduated from college, left the home. Many parents of that age are now either moving back or buying a downtown smaller apartment and then spending time between a suburban and a downtown area. But the point is, now this is not everywhere, but in Chicago, this is huge. In New York, this is very large. And so you have this sort of urbane style is becoming more culturally attractive than it was 20 or 30 years ago. In a sense, suburbia, in that simple sense, is a good place to raise children, but once your children go away to college, you may be bored, and so you want to be back in a downtown area with more of the more sophisticated amenities, which, as people are getting more global, more cosmopolitan, they're traveling more, they want more than what you get in the smaller towns. Okay, so Florida's quick point is, if we simply cut out many of these subsidies for housing and for transportation, we stop building the massive freeways, which essentially are subsidizing cars and subsidizing suburbs. If instead we put the money into downtown divvy bicycles and buses and some cheap mass transit rail, then we can reconfigure and have more, and have not necessarily one model, but we can have more choice. So people who say, I really want the American dream, and that is for me, you know, a suburban house, they can have it, some people can have it, and the prices are going down because more people are saying, you know, I've had enough of the American dream, I want to go elsewhere. The prices are going through the roof of the biggest cities. And the small towns are way down in terms of price, but the point is, if we offer more options, people can choose themselves and have more options to combine even if you're living in, say, who is it from Cincinnati who did the posting? Not here today. Okay. Cincinnati and another place nearby were singled out as being places that are difficult to drive to, or that is that you can only drive there. You need a car, that's a power. I'm responding to that because that's a powerful point. It's true of most of America, but the world is changing. So that is. But the U.S. I just add as a footnote. The U.S. is changing slower than most of Europe. Obviously, China. China is catapulting every 10 years. They're deeply transforming. One-child policy. 4 children down to 1 child. Then say, okay, maybe you can have 2 children. Having that imposed by the government. Massive transformations which make things much deeper, much faster, much more explicit. So compared to China, Eastern Europe has rapidly changed after 1989. Western Europe is still changing faster than the U.S. In these terms, the U.S. is more conservative I would say, in terms of simple lifestyle. Okay, but let's stop with that. Anything else that anybody posted that you'd like to mention or discuss for a little bit, which I didn't catch or didn't? And yeah, it's not easy the way the thing is set up. You can't really tell that I or anybody else has commented on your posting, so you may not know. But is there anything you raised that you'd like to discuss briefly? Yeah.
This actually isn't relevant necessarily to a posting I made, but just to clarify, is this then like a trend that's happening across different age groups in the U.S., or are we seeing this more with older adults or like rising adults?
Well, it's most visibly obvious with older adults. The other massive group it's affecting is people your age, people just are in college or just after college. So people with their first job, say 5-8 years after college, are now marrying later or not at all, and they're not having children, or at least not so fast, and they're staying more often in bigger cities. So yes, for sure.
And also,
these are the yuppies.
Yeah, and like also not necessarily to say one causes the other, but I know like in the past 7 years there's been a change in the kind of demographics there in suburbs. You're seeing a lot more minority groups moving out into the suburbs. Do you think that could be an influencer for the kind of white migration from suburbs, or do you think that's just like another factor that's also happening?
I would doubt it. That is, there have been many studies done of, say, suburban Philadelphia, suburban New York, suburban Chicago. There are huge differences. People who are really racist, who want to be either want to be or feel that they should be or whatever, for all complex, many people have different ways of talking or thinking about these things. That is, there are plenty of all-black suburbs in Chicago, all-black suburbs, like just west and just south of Chicago is now basically heavily black. There are places that are heavily white when you get up toward the Wisconsin border. But there are many others like Oak Park and Evanston, and then others nearby those, that have prided themselves on having a mix of ethnic groups and and so people choose one another. I had one student who did a BA a couple of years ago on a town in New Jersey. I think it was Englewood, New Jersey. I forgot. I'm not sure of the name.
That's it.
Sorry?
That's a town, yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure it's a town. But he had interviews with people who had lived in Brooklyn and Manhattan who had said they wanted their kids to grow up in an ethnically diverse area. They did not want to be in an all-white suburb, and therefore they wanted to see some African Americans, Mexican and other minorities be in the high school, in the public schools of their town, New Jersey, or they weren't going to come, or that is that they choose a different town. So it's a town which is very high income, medium high income, but very explicitly, publicly, ethnically pursuing a mix of backgrounds for the parents and the kids. In that sense, it's like Oak Park or Evanston. So the point is, there are different kinds of people, there are different kinds of mixes and policies. So my general point is not to try to, quote, generalize, but to say, if anything, there simply is more. The the one thing which is clear is education is generally going up, and education is the #1 driver of tolerance as people get more and more tolerant. That's the major driver, which in turn is leading some people in turn to vote for Trump because they feel they're getting it to be a smaller and smaller minority. And they are. In another 20 years, they'll all be dead. That is not all of them, because there'll be some replacements. But the point is, the world is getting more and more, that is, in the 1930s, if you ask these questions, 70% of Americans said, no, I don't want to live next to an African American, don't want them in my schools, don't want their books in a high school library, public library, never invite them to dinner, never have my daughter, okay. I mean, Americans were openly racist in the 1930s, and that has continually gone down, basically.
Yeah, I was reminded of the Killian and Pager article. I think it might have been like an extra thing.
Sorry, which paper?
The Killian and Pager, the one about black criminality.
Killian and Pager.
I think in one of the like extra art things that you posted, it wasn't recommended. It wasn't.
Okay. Yeah, I don't even remember I don't remember the paper myself. So tell us briefly what it says.
It was just talking about conceptions of specifically young black criminality and how perceptions of crime, neighborhoods that have more crime, how those match up to the realities of crime that takes place, and how, it's that one.
Okay. No, but I mean, the point is good that culture is different from crime rates, is different from these other points, and no one simple model is enough. Is the general point, I think, of that. So yes. So anything else with the postings, or that is what we're trying to do through the course, as I think it's getting more clear, is we introduce the key ideas in the first half. We're trying in this whole second half to get you to use these ideas. So your postings, you're thinking about how they work in your town or in another place, or they don't seem to work quite, or how they need to be revised. That's what we want to do. So I will talk if that can be helpful, but dialoguing with you may be the best way, and so, yeah.
Yeah, someone had a post about gentrification and internationalization in China, and then, I think that, raised a lot of questions that were interesting. I think, the big one would be, along, Lloyd's framework.
Sorry, the what?
The big question I would have would be, along, Lloyd's framework. So, okay, so, the summary.
Would you slowly, Lloyd's framework?
Framework.
Richard Lloyd?
Yeah.
Okay.
So to kind of summarize the question, it was, and I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, but in Guangzhou, there was a major national games, the National Games of China was hosted there, and it went from a suburban town over a short period of time to being a major commercial district with international brands and companies and much wealthier residents. And what I thought was interesting, just kind of based on the wording of that response, was it seems it almost kind of skipped over the creative class phase that you and Lloyd and Florida would describe, and kind of went to the end stage of that sort of gentrification. And I was wondering kind of a few different sorts of questions, if there was an intermediary stage, or if the scale of the event really was enough to attract these international brands, and kind of promote this different sort of gentrification than we had been considering. And then also I know it had come up in class before that there's just kind of less of a concept of Bohemian East Asia and where that might fit in to that discussion. And also going back to Richard Lloyd, this seems to be a case of the companies or the firms preceding the people, potentially. That's not clear if that is the case, but just based on the wording of the response. So I'd be curious if the person who puts those here, maybe they know, because that does seem to be kind of maybe anachronistic in terms of what Lloyd is saying, or maybe complicates.
Okay, you made 4 or 5 big points. One quick one. The idea of a stage model that we have to go from A to B to C to D, I would say, is too mechanical. And I would criticize, as I did. I mean, Lloyd was a student of mine here. He did his MA with me, his PhD, and so forth. I would say, second, he presents the Bohemian argument in too deterministic a manner. That is, he makes it sound as if you've got to have Bohemian lifestyle, you've got to break eggs if you're going to be creative. And he says explicitly, I am making a more strong version of this argument than Edward Glaser or Jane Jacobs or others, based on what? I mean, based on the fact that he has a feisty style. Okay, and he loves to be feisty. He was an options trader for 5 or 10 years before he wrote his PhD. So it gives you his style. He grew up in Oakland, California. So, 2 points. If we revise those to be more qualified and multi-causal, and we say, okay, sure, Rich, that's a good point, but don't say it's everything. Just say it's one factor along with the others. And when pushed, he said, well, maybe. But then the third point is comparative. That is, he wrote that based on one neighborhood in Chicago. He subsequently has gone to Nashville and has written about Nashville very thoughtfully and tried to sort of think about the South, but his basic frame is pretty much the same kind of thing. The big point is he's not comparative in the sense of looking for either cities in the U.S. or other countries that would be drastically different. So when I wrote to him, I wrote to Rich Florida and others, I say, hey, your model doesn't work in Asia, guys. What are we going to do? Oh, they say, oh, the hell with the Asians, you know. And my answer is, the theory is wrong. The Asians are doing it right. I mean, look at the Asians are booming. They've got, China's booming, Korea's booming, etc. So there's something wrong with our theories, which are too Western, if they're not working in Asia. So, and it's not Asia specifically, it's a different combination of factors, which may well be not uniquely Asian. That is, there's no Bohemian Saudi Arabia either. Okay? But it's just that, okay, so Saudi Arabia is, again, okay, so to make one more point, then linking your 2 or 3 earlier points, which I'm responding to one at a time, you can get interesting combinations of these styles, illustrated, for instance, by Silicon Valley engineers. Often in the past, they were often Indian, Pakistani, Indian, very smart, often poor guys who'd gone to engineering school in India. Then they came to Silicon Valley, and they had brilliant ideas. They wrote new programs. They rose within Google or Microsoft, whatever, or they formed their own little companies. They've got hundreds of little companies. So these people became, multimillionaires, billionaires, and then some of them went back to India, and they said, I'm loyal to India. And many were Chinese as well. So Chinese and Indians were the largest 2 ethnic groups, or they may have gone back to Thailand or somewhere else. But China and India most of all, and there are books written about this, such as the World is Flat. The World is Flat by the New York Times bestseller editorial writer has a long case study to start it out, and the statement, the world is flat, really came from an Indian engineer who was saying, we can compete with anybody anywhere in the world, and we can do it cheaper here in India because we got smart people, we don't need to live in California, and we can build better programs that will run better, faster, and so we're ready to contract out hospital data, bank back office stuff, send it to us from Zurich or from New York, and we'll do it here in India. And they've done that for billions of dollars worth in the last 20 years. Okay, if you then look within India and say, or within China, what's happening? They're going from poor, you could be a poor village peasant, quasi, farmer, and you can be smart on your exams, go to an engineering school, and then go to work in one of these companies and never leave India. And you're in post-industrial, contracting out, doing all kinds of stuff. So in that sense, the stage, and you may have never heard of Bohemia. Mm-hmm. So the stage model of Lloyd in Florida is too simple. And so where and how these things specifically vary, depends on different combinations. So as I think it was in this class, one of you asked, don't we have some Bohemia in Japan? Or didn't we have a little bit? Didn't we talk about that here? Is it this or the other class? I think it was this class. But basically, you had a very active, militant Bohemian kind of group in the late 60s, early 70s in Japan. But it then disappeared. And so you had a bit in Korea, much less in China, a bit in Taiwan. But the point is, the massive transformation called the counterculture or bobos and so forth, which you have today in Western Europe and the US, is much less present in Asia. And so, and the simple reason is the family is stronger. The grandmothers were there saying, that skirt is too short, you can't go out, young lady, and so forth. So for instance, of how public an issue these were, when in the so-called the meat protests, it was the biggest Korean protest about 5 years ago. There were all kinds of groups protesting. And so I talked to Korean students and said, who's there? What's happening? That is, we're trying to see. This is my fifth possible topic I can talk about today, and I'll mention it very briefly, and we can come back if you want. I've got PowerPoints and so forth. The thing that we haven't elaborated in this class is some of the mechanisms involved with new social movements, and I'll just throw out the label, and we can come back if you want. You know about the new social movements. They are the environment, women, gays and lesbians, human rights, the classic big ones. They've been around since the 1970s, and their model is sort of like a political party or like the civil rights movement in the sense that they have boards, they have organizations, they have membership cards, you can pay a fee. Don't let me forget my fee. Okay, got here. And so forth, even if they were excluded from the parties, which is why they were called new social movements. Okay, the new social movements, the adjective new is there twice, don't have membership cards, they don't have a board, they don't have any officers, but they're there in places like the beef protest in Seoul, they're there in Hong Kong, they're there in the Occupy movements. That is, lots of people just show up, and nobody said you're officially invited. They just said, "Hey, this is an activity I want to participate in." Are they, what's their ideology? Nobody knows. But the point is, this is not just a handful of events, as the New York Times or let's say even the smart undergraduate USC students who were activist political organizers, they went to, many worked with me in papers, went to the Occupy movements in Chicago, and they walked all around, they interviewed people, and they said, we don't want to work with these people, they're not committed. They won't join with our organization, they won't join with any organization, they're here to take photographs of each other and have a good time. Okay, the point is, this is not just Occupy Chicago. This is happening all around the world. Okay. However, given that, when I had some of these students who were then Korean, we said, are there any specific organizations within the beef protest in Korea that you want to mention? And so one woman said, yes, there's the Short Skirt Brigade. I said, really? I never heard of that. What's the Short Skirt Brigade? Oh, it's an official organization in Korea of young women who don't want to wear skirts of the length that their grandmothers tell them they should wear. It's what in the 20 years ago we called new social issues in Western Europe and the US. Okay, so the point is, the grandmothers have been critical players in Asia, but they're slowly withdrawing as their granddaughters are wearing shorter skirts. Not all of them, not everywhere, but some of them. And I just mentioned that example as just to take one other more extreme example. I talked to Koreans and Chinese. That is, when that visit, when I was there with Richard Fleur, the mayor of Seoul, had a conference on how can Seoul become a new post-industrial kind of leadership city in the world. How can we be more creative? So we met, we talked, and so forth. And Florida went right back on an airplane, and I stayed on a couple of weeks. And I kept talking to people and asked, for instance, how many gays are there in Korea? Not very many. I said, how are they treated? And then this was maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And I was told the story. There was a well-known TV anchorman who came out and announced that he was gay. He was fired by the network. He tried to get another job for 2 years. He could not get a job, and he committed suicide. It was considered a famous scandal that gays were not tolerated by the Korean establishment. Okay, that was maybe 7 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, everything has changed in Korea. Today, in the last 2 years or so, and Hee-sun, who spoke to you a week or two ago, and she's from Seoul, she's documenting this bohemian lifestyle in Paris, where it began in the 1830s with Balzac, and then in Chicago, where it's new, but it's with Wicker Park, and now in Seoul. But the point is, so she asked the same questions that you asked about the stages. And I said, don't assume they're stages, look and see what you have, because Korea's going through many different, don't assume that they're the same universal stage. So she found through her ethnography and her photos that people were marching back and forth in front of the Seoul City Hall, who were the LGBT supporters, and then the activist fundamentalist churches who were LGBT opponents, saying the family, preserve the family. So they are fighting each other actively in Seoul right now. But the point is, it's not just, that is, 10 years ago, it was or 50 years ago, it was the grandmothers saying, be more conservative. Today, these look more like the West in the 1960s. We don't want to, maybe I shouldn't have even have said that, in the sense that every country is unique, every situation is I mean, we don't want to go that far, say that there are no generalities, but don't apply stages mechanically. But the quick point I'm making, just to get to one more sentence after this, is I then talked to the Chinese students. I said, how are gays treated in China? Okay, 10 years ago, people said, nobody talks about gays in China. 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I talked to students. Oh, being gay is the coolest thing right now. All the sportsmen, the radio announcers, politicians are coming out as gay and so forth. So even in China, this is happening as well. But I guess the bigger interesting point is, without an activist bohemian driver or stage. That's the bigger theoretical point. So people can be artists, people can be, and is someone in this class doing a paper on hip hop? I mean, it's either this class or the other. Is hip hop, rap in Beijing. I've read a couple of papers on this already, and the big finding is hip hop and rap in Beijing are not bohemian. I mean, you have the sound, the music sounds the same, the style is the same, but not the anger at the establishment, the bohemian sort of, tear them down and burn them all down and start over. That is not present in China. And so the hip hoppers and others dress in much more elegant style in their own clothes as well as their fans. So I'll stop with this. I think I've tried to give you, using the Asian example, and most of what I'm saying is an elaboration from the book, of course, Can Tocqueville Karaoke, which was a 7-8 year continuing discussion of these kinds of people within, so Yoshiaki Kobayashi, Wono Jang, I mean a series of them in Korea, Japan, China, talking about these issues, conferences, emailing, writing draft papers, analyzing data back and forth, and then we put together a selection of it there in order to understand better what's happening globally, not just to focus on Asia, but to use Asia as an exception to understand the more important cases of deviation, which you had. Obviously in Western Europe, you've got the terrorist groups, the anti-terrorist groups, the National Front in France, the winning of these elections in Germany, France, England, and the U.S. By strong candidates who were anti-immigrant, anti-terrorist, immigrants in various ways. So the point is not that there's one pattern, but we've got more explicit, more politicized, more conflictual, sometimes subgroups that are fighting against each other. So my answer to that is not to try to say France is this way and China is that, but to look at the dynamics within France, within China, and see how young people who go to hip-hop concerts, how they feel about these issues in China or in Korea, and how are they similar or different from their counterparts in other places. Okay, follow up. Any other points like that of sort of applying? You raised 4 or 5 questions. I think I addressed most of them, but anything I missed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that got at what I was like curious about, and I'd also just like if the person who did post that, I would just be curious to hear if they know more about Zia.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, so was it that like the scale of the event was enough to like suddenly attract like these huge corporations, or?
Actually the influence of the event might not be that much, but I think the key driver is the urban planning, and they the government firstly they held a game there, and they saw, oh, okay, so there's still some there are already some constructions in that district, so and also it's quite a suburban area, so there's not many other established things in that area, so it's a good place to grow the new things. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so I think that maybe the urban planning may be a more important driver. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because it almost sounds like entertainment as a growth machine. Like the city was deliberately maybe like directing like a big event at a city that they wanted to develop like economically.
Well, to make explicit sort of the exchange between you, government and the state, national, regional, local, is definitely more important, a lot more important in China than here, and more important than even France. And France, which has been more documented and studied in this way, I mean, has, for instance, if you look at local cultural events like local concerts, musical concerts, folklore events, and so forth, roughly 50 to 60% of the money spent on these local events, and there are lots of them in France, is passed by the city council. Only 15% is from the Ministry of Culture, so this is not the national, these are not national programs. Then the rest are regional, and only a very small portion is from ticket sales or foundations. Whereas in the US, ticket sales and foundations are going to be much bigger. Then you'll have some entrepreneurship, which is more important. But the government is going to be much smaller. So in that sense, the actors are different, but where and why does that change in the content? I mean, to know that the state is more involved does not mean necessarily that they're anti-bohemian. I mean, there are plenty, certainly in France, there are plenty of bohemian local towns that, that love to have long green hair and so forth. I mean, Arles is a classic town I just read a case study of, which was it was a beautiful Roman place where they have a Roman forum still. It was the place where Van Gogh went away from the rain in the Netherlands, and there's a museum for Van Gogh. And then you now have Gary, the Los Angeles architect, is transforming it, not the whole city, but they're adding on to this a new layer of contemporary art, museums, architecture, and so forth in ways that are heavily funded by the heiress of a big Zurich or Swiss drug company who grew up in the town herself. So she feels, and it's totally endorsed by the mayor, who is an explicit communist mayor, who says, long live Gary and long live these new innovations. So they're all doing it together in ways that break the traditional rules. So even if that is to know the names, that one is communist or one is state or one is private, doesn't tell you what their preferences are. Mm-hmm. That's my big point about business and business leadership. Doesn't tell you what businesses do. or it doesn't tell what the government does, because they're all different kinds of government, including within China. Okay, any more comments, questions, observations from all around, and any as I've said, I can go back and look at some readings we haven't talked about, but having stuff come from you is fine. You haven't talked to us much. Where are you from?
Kansas City.
Kansas City. How does Kansas City fit with any stuff we talked about?
Well, a lot of the Lloyd stuff makes sense, but I feel like it's different now because it's like mainly a college town, so you only see really like college kids and then families of like the professors that live there, but and the majority of the students all drive regardless of where they're from, and then only a small portion of it's really like a walkable city really starting to expand.
Did it seem more like, say, Lawrenceville in the book by Schumacher? I talked about Lawrence a little bit. As most people citizens seem to want urban development and growth rather than put differently. Is there a what's the student culture like? Does it have a bohemian style, or is it more a football college,
More of like
suburban, or
football
that's a sorority, fraternity, drinking? Yeah. And that's Chicago, as you know, I'm just telling mostly the visiting foreigners, is not representative of most American higher education, where you have drinking, football, beer, bars, and so forth. And so in that sense, it's not surprising that Kansas City is a fair amount of that. Okay. Anything that you've heard in the course that sort of made you prick up in your ears? How would that work in Kansas City?
I mean, not really, but I feel like the whole bohemianism thing isn't very big, like even in the downtown.
Okay, is not very big.
Yeah.
Okay, now see that fit. I mean, in that sense, it's like China. Okay, so this is good. I mean, you get an American university town, essentially, not bohemian. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Not necessarily like the university town, but I mean just like in the downtown areas in general. Like it's very like traditional. Like you have like Sprint Center and like all of those different arenas, and then even then it's not like a very walkable city. Like you have to take your car on everywhere. And most of it's like parking garages and like big restaurants with like lack of sidewalks and like accessibility from getting from one point to the other.
And clearly, this is true of most middle-sized American cities. And that's it's good to bring that out. In the sense that as you've heard me say, we're not looking for a middle town. We're not looking for one representative. There is no, that's the point. There is no representative middle town. Don't look for it. Look for variations and explicitly try to say Chicago's this way because, Kansas City is that way because, and so forth. And that then can lead us to more of the variables which lead to I talked recently with a student who's from Colorado Springs, Colorado, and he made the point. It's the head of the U.S. Air Force Academy, and there's several evangelical churches with their headquarters there, and it's a strong Christian, socially conservative town, probably much more so than Kansas City. But the point is, there's variation, and so to have this, and I'm sure there's much less bohemian style there than there is even in Kansas City. Comment, question?
No, it's interesting that she's saying there's not a lot of bohemianism in Kansas City, because where I'm from, which is like another kind of small, probably smaller than Kansas City or Urbana, like I would say that the downtowns are like very much kind of, especially within my lifespan, like very much becoming bohemian, and like you see that as kind of part of the identity of the town.
Okay, but Urbana, yeah, let's, in just a brief comment, go ahead, try to contrast Urbana with Kansas
Well,
City.
I don't
And
know almost anything about Kansas City because I didn't know.
But what, but how?
Well, I guess Urbana seems smaller than Kansas City, and it's very walkable. There's two towns, but Urbana itself is walkable. And the downtown kind of merges with the campus town. And you're seeing kind of like new businesses spring up that are very artsy, I guess, have that feel, which is why I would say that it feels bohemian. And then, you know, there's a farmer's market in the summer, and that's very strong, and co-ops, things like that.
What proportion of the students and faculty, maybe just as much as students, faculty, young faculty, teaching assistants, come from Chicago or Madison or LA or whatever, rather than being homegrown downstate Illinois?
Everyone, almost everyone. I mean, most students come from Chicago, but faculty come
Okay,
from all over.
very important. Okay, if we ask the same of Kansas City, how many of the students in Kansas City are from Chicago? Very few, I would bet. Okay, so that, in that sense, Urbana is more of a cosmopolitan, attracting institution. I mean, it's more, that what are the what are the leading universities in Kansas City that attract students?
KU, UMKC. Those are the two big.
Okay, University of Missouri, Kansas City is a very highly ranked medical school.
Yeah.
But apart from the medical school, it's not, that is, it's not so highly ranked. Whereas, I mean, Urbana is the place where they created the internet. That is the idea of a browser. Well, the Internet Explorer was really created in Urbana. It has a very high level engineering department there. So there's certain individual departments at Urbana that attract people from England, from Germany, and who come there to study as MA students, even as, I mean, I've known some as BA students. So in that sense, it's more linked to London, to Berlin, to Chicago's bohemian lifestyle. And you know, I knew a guy who was, I mean, just a case of one. He was transferring after 2 years of college in England. He was going to Urbana, and he arrived with a knapsack and a skateboard on his knapsack. Okay, and that was a couple of decades ago. So what I'm doing in answering this question is, in a sense, it's good to take a case like this and say how and why, and then to ask, I mean, the very simple basics. So the question, who is the theorist who led to the question I first asked about where are the students and faculty from? Which theorist told you to look at that? Yes?
Elazar, culture is carried on the backs of people.
There we go. So not deterministic, I mean, that's not the full explanation of Urbana, but certainly it's part. And if you at least start with that and say, you know, where are those students and young faculty from in Urbana, and if the answer is they're from New York and Berlin, and I mean, that's a big, certainly something, yeah.
I was going to add as well, because I'm also from a college town, but I'm from Princeton, New Jersey. So a town where it's very dictated by one school, obviously Princeton, but it's in the same way that maybe Kansas City is a very not bohemian, because it's seeped in culture and tradition. And Princeton, I mean, it's a leading university, so it attracts people from all over the world. At the same time, there's a very visible town-count divide, because the town side holds on to its tradition and its roots for the past hundreds of years, while the school is obviously trying to change it. Like, there was a recent scandal about removing Woodrow Wilson's name from a building from the school because he was the president. So there's always this very visible tension between the town and the students that are coming to populate it.
Excellent example. why, I mean, but I mean, the most intriguing thing to me is the lack of bohemia. What, I mean, even though, I mean, one thinks in general, say of Berkeley, Austin, Madison, I mean, high quality state schools and so forth, private schools, let's say, probably Harvard, Stanford, have strong bohemian elements. Princeton has much less.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it's often considered the most conservative Ivy. The entire town has been settled since the colonies, and even the school culture itself is built on youth clubs and sororities, fraternities, secret societies. So a lot of these traditions have remained in the town, and it remains a very white, very upper class town, even when it's bordered by towns 5 minutes away like Trenton. So in that it remains a very bubble town because of its history that they try to hold on to.
Okay. I mean, excellent answers. I mean, 3 interesting cases that illuminate the Chinese variations. That is, we could do the same if we probably focused on those 3 towns I mentioned outside Beijing, where we had 3 different mayors, 3 different policies in terms of the degree of working with the national government, in terms of the kinds of development which they had. And so the point is there's lots of local variation, and we can build propositions. The higher the education, the more the et cetera, you tend to be more tolerant, but look at Princeton, it doesn't necessarily make you bohemian, as in Seoul or as in other places. So excellent variations. David Brooks, who wrote the 2 books about Bobos, actually did a fair amount of field work trying to write about the life of people at Princeton, of the college students, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I don't think he's finished it. He's done a book on it. He has a couple of papers. 1 and 2. The other thing that's changed in the last, that is 20 years ago, the USC may have ranked 10th, 12th, 15th, or so forth among American colleges. We were strong, but we weren't as high as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. In the last year since you have come, you are now roughly the same. That is, we are now roughly equal to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania. I mean, the Ivy League schools, in terms of the talents, the raw talents of the students, are now about the same. So but they differ. Probably they will become more explicitly differing more based on their local cultures, just the way cities do. In the sense that you can't just say we've got the highest SAT scores. The question is, we've got the Logan Arts Center. We've got art and theory and culture, and the USC has done more of this, hugely increased, than any other major university in the country. On the other hand, Harvard and Yale had a lot more in the past in terms of arts. But they haven't increased and made that kind of new commitment with new programs, with visiting artists and all kinds of things. So in that sense, this is just one example of the ways that if you're not competing with efficiency, economy, price, you can compete with culture. And that's what Apple, Samsung, and political leaders are doing in a similar manner, as our local leaders like mayors. Other comments or questions? Yes.
So since you brought up the idea that there isn't much fraternity life at U of C, I was just wondering
it's here, but it's different from other places. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering if there was any specific, if there is any literature along those lines that, or any thoughts that you had about fraternity life and whether its presence or its lack of presence would be an edge in attracting students along the lines you've discussed. And when I say that, I'm emphasizing both things, and this is a little bit of a controversial issue, so I'm not making a stance.
I did my BA on fraternities as political socialization agents. Because when I went to college, there's a little college in Maine called Bowdoin, fraternities were the only place you could eat. That is, if you were a freshman, you had to join a fraternity in the first couple of weeks, or you couldn't eat anywhere. There was a tiny cafeteria, and it would only eat, you could feed 30, 40 people. So you had to join a fraternity, and they were all recruiting you in the first weeks you arrived. So they were all putting on different styles. And they were very politically important, but they had many different. So I did my BA, but not only did I survey the students locally, but I used items, and you could do this in a paper or a BA. If you want to understand something, say at the USC or Kansas or Urbana, take questions which have been used elsewhere. Don't write your own questions. Take the questions that have already been used in Beijing and in the University of Paris and the University of California. Then ask them the same question in Kansas City, for instance, and then you can see how does Kansas City calibrate against all these other places. So that's what I did, and when I did it, lo and behold, I found decades ago that Bowdoin students were very fiscally conservative and very socially tolerant. And I've been writing about that in books ever since.
Yeah, because it's not a contradiction.
Sorry?
I mean, some people would say that's a contradiction.
But I've been writing books to show why it's not a contradiction. and put differently, 60% or so of American citizens, old and young, European citizens, Japanese citizens say the same thing, that they want lower taxes and higher services and tolerance.
Do you have any books where you write specifically about that kind of, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, and how that dynamic works, or is that kind of these three?
No, it's a critical point. I mean that most people still, as most I would say most Americans are generally less ideological than many of the Europeans. You take the most ideological Europeans, this absolutely can't be put together. But they've just elected a president of France who's basically said the same thing. So what that is, I saw it in the Bowdoin students, and then I sort of put it aside. But then we saw it in the 1970s in interviewing cities around the U.S. I worked a lot in those years with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, so we put on workshops. And one was with Helen Buzales, who was the president of Lincoln, Nebraska, and she was then national president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And she said, yes, I was elected and I am fiscally conservative, but I am very socially liberal, and I want to make government more efficient so we can put these things together. And she said, and I'm trying to lead this and I said, well, isn't this this is a big important step, because I knew the membership and the leadership of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. It was classic left-right, traditional Democrat, traditional Republican, like the parties in Washington today and for decades. So she said, yes, but we don't want to have conflict within the organization, so we just do it quietly. So quietly, they may have been. She said all the mayors that I know and I'm friends of think the same way, but we don't announce it. We don't want to fight with the staff. So the staff was basically classic New Deal Democrat. However, different mayors and different presidents, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Francois Mitterrand, and now Macron, for instance, really followed this pattern of being socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and then wanting more services for citizens and lower taxes. So how can you possibly do this? We had a couple of conversations on this. If you look at selected, there are dramatic extremes in places like Chicago or many others, and so at least in terms of making political noise, if you focus on the most corrupt, the most visible. So actually the biggest dollar, probably the biggest dollar action was the national government of China fired 1/3 of the whole national government staff. I told you that. And then 3 years later, they said, okay, let's do the same thing for the state and local governments. Fire your staff. And what happened? Nothing. The local governments were autonomous enough that they could say to the national government, we're not firing anybody. In that sense, there may be grist in China. So for instance, a number of them even passed, or it wasn't passed by the city council was against this. We had a brilliant case study by one guy who had lots of family members who were mayors and council members and working in a small government in China. And so he wrote about how, and so there was a very smart Communist Party leader who came to the town and who dramatically changed the town. And one thing they said was, no government staff may invite anybody else to lunch, or they cannot go to lunch with local or other business or civic leaders. Because the lunches were the classic way. Well, one, they're expensive. If they do it in an elegant Chinese way with many courses, the lunches alone are expensive. But two, they're a mechanism which encourages, if you give me this, I'll give you that. And so they wanted to keep the bureaucrats in their offices, not asking for bribes, not being able to say, give me a bribe and I'll approve your dog food and we can ship it off to the Americans. And so that clearly there's a lot of that going on all around the world, not just China. I'm just mentioning China to say there's a huge amount, and people are. And the point is, many political leaders from Macron to Norway to Italy are campaigning on exactly these issues and winning elections. Then they're trying to feature. We've been at meeting after meeting after meeting for decades now, where we'll have mayors and council members and others come up and show you examples of what they have done, similar to the Chinese national government, of cutting staff, in measuring the quality of services which have been the same or improved in selected areas. At the same time, they've cut back on things which were less desirable or wasteful. Okay, that's the short version. But their book's called The New Political Culture, and there's 6 or 7 books on this, studied it in terms of mayors. A book called Urban Innovation is on mayors. New Political Culture is a combination of sources in 20 countries, and we read sections of those. There's a book with the breakdown of class politics I did with Marty Lipset, which looks at how class politics as a paradigm is weakened by this. And then there are 2 books on citizens, and citizen engagement and participation is a key driver of a lot of this as well. If you ask citizens or ask lower level government staff, you find ways of getting lower level government staff to make suggestions. How could we make, the parking system or the bus repair shop work more efficiently? And you give them, encouragement or promotion or something. They're the ones who can really make the most valuable suggestions about how to make service delivery more efficient. This is the topic of our main visitor from China. How to make service delivery work better in China. One simple thing: ask the lower level staff and find ways that they will be listened to, not punished, not fired, but quietly. They can be anonymous. They can leave in anonymous letters or emails, all kinds of things. But they know, they see many things that the top level people may be hiding or just not know about. Other observations, comments? And we've explored how that change, that dramatic change with this new political culture in turn drives many other urban policy changes. It opens you up to the arts, to social consumption, to finding new issues. That is, in the old days, in Taiwan, not to just talk about China, talk about Taiwan. I had several students from Taiwan. And I said, how's politics different in Taiwan from China or from the U.S.? Well, we have more open clientelism. For instance, it's known that if you want to have people vote for a presidential candidate, you have to pay them $762. An exact dollar amount. You've got to put $762 cash in an envelope and pass it out to each person. to have them vote for the president. Okay, I mean, if it's that codified, that in a sense is also something which can be openly attacked and has been attacked by later candidates. But it simply points to the degree to which you can look for mechanisms like this of going on. And I mean, so I'm mentioning Taiwan, but you find things like this in most countries of the world today. Yep.
I just wonder with like, if there's been studies of like, countries that have mandated voting versus countries that don't have mandated voting, and like how that affects how people vote and how this works. I know it's really broad.
Okay, well, but I guess I'm sighing because that's a law. It's easy to pass a law.
Right.
It's much harder to change what people do. And then third, it's harder still to change how they think and raise their children and say what's good or bad. So what country is what's the best known country in the world that's done that? Australia. Okay, so Australia requires you to vote. So does Italy. Okay, you gotta vote in Italy to be, but does that mean that Italy now shares the good government perspective that the Australians have? No. People in Sicily are still Sicilians. So I'm not saying the laws don't make any difference, but the laws alone are often not enough. And they're embedded in a lot more, and they often change together. So the EU, we've had some discussions of this. The EU is having a big impact over time, cumulatively, on the European political culture. And it's making the north and the south of Europe closer. Asia does not have that. There is no counterpart, and there were attempts to do this 10 or 15 years ago. And they basically have failed. So some have even said, we've had Trumps in Asia for years, in the sense that nationalism is stronger in Asia than it is in Europe, where you've got at least a number. Macron, it's obviously divisive, but Germany and France at least are more committed to a cross-national building of a European identity than people are in Asia, or than obviously Trump is right now. Yes, in the back. Monsieur Français, please.
Actually, in the last French
A
election,
little bit louder.
actually, in the last French election, there were more candidates which were against the European Union than in favor of the European Union. So that shift is, I would say it doesn't exist, but it's like relative, because Macron won, and a few other candidates were also had an objective of building a strong Europe, but in a way, I think one of the main points of the whole campaign was like back to France first, in a way.
Was what?
Back to France first.
Back to France first.
Many parties, like left and right.
Okay, so it's an important point. So even if the National Front, this strong nationalist anti-immigrant party, a year or two ago looked as if it might have been number one. I mean, it looked as if, the leader, Madame Le Pen, she was the number one party. Then Macron came along. He created his own party from nothing, and he beat all the major parties, in part because the citizens were tired, it seems, of both the National Front and the normal left, center, and right parties. And so that fits with your question about, can this happen anywhere? And that is, my quick answer is, this is what citizens want. And if citizens really want it, then you get leaders like Macron or Tony Blair and so forth who say, this is my program, I'm really going to do this. Now, half of that 10%, 80% maybe lies, or hopes, or desires rather than a strong program. But if you're forced and you've campaigned on it and you said you're going to do it, look at Trump. Maybe you'll keep on trying. Even if you fail, even if it's disaster, at least. Okay. So an electoral mandate can make a difference. Okay. One more case. Let's take one more city. Where are you from?
I'm from Orange County, from Blue Yorba Linda, California.
Okay, Orange County. Tell us a little bit about Orange County.
It's not really a city, it's just a bunch of smaller cities, I mean, but there's no like main downtown area. I'm from Yorba Linda, and Orange County itself is fairly conservative in the blue state. And Yorba Linda is very much like prides itself on its high standard of living. And a few years ago it was like listed as one of the wealthiest like cities in the US, not because there's really that many like substantially wealthy people, but because Yorba Linda has a lot of zoning restrictions for apartments and things like that. So they do a lot to try to keep lower socioeconomic status people out.
Okay. Orange County, as I may have mentioned, has been surveyed. The citizens have been surveyed in every town. The city council members and mayors were surveyed in every town for about 10 or 15 years by Mark Baldessari, who has a chapter in this book called The New Political Culture. He's gone on, he's written books about the state of California. He's been the head of the, I think it's called the Public PPI, the Public Policy Institute, I think that's it, or the California Public Policy Institute. So he's done statewide surveys, but Orange County is probably the most studied city, county of cities in the entire world because of him and because of the dramatic battles they've had. The county went bankrupt, they've had battles over the freeways, etc. So there have been a lot of people who've come in, and there are many universities, Irvine, and so forth, that are there, where people have also studied things locally to try to see how and why is it changing. And just one quick example. When if you look at Baldessari's writings, the biggest single visible issue was away from the John Wayne Airport, the classic male, macho, traditional Republican style of the cowboy who led the family and led the good life, to a women-oriented collective kind of activity, not necessarily at all of Berkeley, but nevertheless the mayor of Irvine would lead hand-holding blocking of the freeways at rush hour to try to protest the freeways and to say we must change in the direction of giving up this decentralized single-family dwelling. We need to have public transit. We need to have ways of living in more dense lifestyle. And some of these cities even within Orange County, even though people laugh when you say that, because it's a quintessential suburban freeway generated, undermined, maintained area. Okay, so great differences. Then obviously lots of very highly talented Asians send their children and families, or often wives with children, will go there part-time and so forth. I had one student, Joseph Yee, was a TA and assistant here for years, and he led tutorials. I mean, he would tutor the students who would come from China and from Korea on how to pass the SAT exams and the GRE exams, either here or in Europe or in China and Korea. So he had a wonderful sense of how the different ethnic composition. The Chinese go here, the Koreans go there, the Japanese go to this town. You can get, if you really want high-end Japanese, Chinese cuisine, you can get it there in ways that you can't anywhere else in the U.S. and so forth. So it's a fascinating place, and these, I'm mentioning 2 or 3 of these dynamics, which just show how different it is from the old style. What's the name of the airport, though?
John Wayne.
John Wayne Airport is still the airport. Okay, so you can watch the old style movies and see how much it's changed. One more question or comment. Somebody from outside the U.S. We had France. Anything else you want to elaborate? Let's see. When you spoke a little about China, you've been a little quiet. Tell us, you're working on a PhD and you're thinking about topics, and you send me wonderful emails. You're very thoughtful, but you don't talk very much. That's in part the language barrier. But you want to ask or comment at all on this one?
Not much, but there is a problem. But there is still
still a confusion you want to figure out,
Yeah.
which includes, okay, if you can get an English word, or you want to mention a Chinese word to others who maybe can help you
Okay.
translate.
I just want to figure out the relationship between the cultural space and the cultural creativity, but I think between this there's still a thing like cultural the urban cultural, but I cannot really figure out the regulations or the elements between these three things, and I think about it several days, and I still want to figure out a chart or
Who would suggest how to answer her question? How about this? Go through each section of the syllabus on the course and say, how would each of the main authors contribute one or two propositions to my question? So when we talked about Urbana and Princeton and Kansas City, we asked, why is Princeton so different and different from Urbana and more like Kansas City in that way and more like China? And so if we say so, and the answer which we started with was Elazar. So Elazar would have a simple proposition. The people who come there are the major creators of the possible drivers of that process. But if we would then go down the reading list a little further, we can find 1, 2, 3, 4 other propositions from others. So I would say, why not tell yourself, let me use, now that I've read more, I've listened to more discussions section by section, try to go through the major readings with 1, 2, 3 stars. And you should have some answers to that question, your question, from each of those authors. And probably all of you could do the same if you said, you know, how or why is Orange County different? You could go through Elazar, you could go through Dahl, you could go through Dennis Judd, and say, what would each of these authors have to say about why my location is different? Okay. Office hours now afterward, if anyone wants to talk further.